Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Amy Luers, who is the Global Lead for Sustainability Science at Microsoft, which has taken a prominent role over recent years in exploring the potential for carbon dioxide removal. Ms. Luers was previously the Executive Director of Future Earth, a global network of scientists, researchers, and innovators collaborating for a more sustainable planet. And before that, she was Assistant Director of Climate Resilience and Information in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Senior Environmental Program Manager at Google, and she led the climate program for the Union of Concerned Scientists in California. Amy, welcome to C2GTalk.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, maybe we'll start with a simple one. What does the Global Lead for Sustainability Science at Microsoft do?
So our team helps the company with its mission on sustainability across the board. And it really has three sort of buckets of areas of work. The first is to support our company's operations. We have big commitments, as you said, to be carbon negative, water positive, land positive, protect more land than we use, and zero waste by 2030. And to do that, we want to be directed by science, making sure our strategies are guided by science. But we also have an industry, sustainability industry, where we help companies go on the road that we're going on, and partners around the world. And in that context as well, we want to make sure we're developing the tools, working with customers to bring science and technology together to these solutions. Okay. And finally, the third area is enabling conditions, creating the enabling conditions, whether it be policy, advancing science issues, advancing new technologies in the space that is beyond Microsoft, and standard settings as well. Working with the community outside of Microsoft to make sure that the enabling conditions for Microsoft to achieve and all of our customers to achieve is really critical to our team's work as well.
Great. So perhaps let's talk a little bit about the context. It's been a tricky few months for international climate cooperation, and the recent UN Climate Summit in Egypt underlined essentially a growing sense of injustice, I think, in developing countries, that they're suffering the costs of a crisis they did not cause, which is harming their development objectives. At the same time, you know, there was some progress on loss and damage, but there was not much progress on mitigation and cutting, you know, ending fossil fuel emissions. I just wonder what your thoughts were on what more could be done to ensure both climate goals and development goals are essentially working hand in hand in a way that's equitable and fair?
Yeah, I think this is, in many ways, been the question throughout the equity issue is sort of, I see as the central theme of the climate struggle from the beginning, right? It is this inequities in the world of who's responsible, who has been predominantly responsible, who is most vulnerable, is not a new topic, but is kind of reemerging in the discussion with greater intensity as we're experiencing the impacts of climate change much more intensely in recent years. And it was sort of inevitable that it would reemerge in such a dramatic way in many ways. This was actually the root of my sort of dissertation work years back, and was my motivation to come into this space of thinking about how do we deal at a global level with these issues. And I, there is certainly no simple answer, but I think that the key direction that we need to head, and that we are beginning to head, is just the recognition that issues of equity and social justice aren't separate from the core challenges of climate, and has to be integrated into every part, not attached on afterwards, not a separate stream, but core to this. So we need mitigation, we need adaptation, we need to think about loss and damage issues, and all of those are embedded into it. We have to think about equity issues, and we do this at Microsoft. At Microsoft we do have a social equity and justice program within our core sustainability work, but we also have it that part of that person's role, just like my role, is to look at science across all of those. My team's role is to look at science across all of our programs. Our environmental justice program is to look at social justice across all these programs, make sure it's embedded into our investments in the Climate Innovation Fund, make sure it's invested in our policy work, make sure it's invested in our business work, in our purchasing of renewables. We have this lens that's really embedded throughout. And I've been really, one of the things, many things I love about working at Microsoft is it actually is one of the core values when we do our reporting too. We are asked that question: how are we addressing these issues? And so I think embedding it at that depth is really important and has taken a while. I feel we've come a long way on that relative to how we used to think about this, 20 years ago when we were starting to address the climate issue.
And we certainly hear a lot more, amongst climate experts and to a certain degree policymakers on these issues. At the same time, a lot of countries in the global north are facing increasing financial pressures. So companies from those global north countries, are you still seeing the actual sort of level of practical support that, or the development of a willingness of people in the global north at a time of financial pressures to help support essentially developing countries do the transition that they need to deal with the consequences, loss and damage, adapt to the changing climate, which after all came from primarily activities in the global north? Are you actually seeing this justice talk put into real action at a time of financial pressures, or is it something that might only be done in a less financially pressed time?
Well, of course, the financial situation globally is challenging for every aspect of society, right? I think it hasn't. I don't think it's put the brakes as one might have thought on the climate space and the sustainability world as one might fear. Maybe just a slowing down and thinking about different things in different areas. But I think that it is still front and center of the business community's world. It certainly is front and center in Microsoft. I think one of the challenges is, integrating equity issues across policies and recognizing that global cooperation means that we need to address the issues of adaptation and loss and damage together with mitigation is critical. One of the challenges for operationalizing that is, as I see it, the challenge of quantifying and putting metrics to adaptation and loss and damage and distinguishing that from development aid. And I think that has slowed down the challenges of investment in adaptation, both from even things like World Bank and USAID, but also philanthropy and also private sector. It's constrained our ability to integrate this in an effective way. And I think constrains the ability to think productively about how even to address loss and damage, because there is this spectrum of what's development aid and what is actually this contribution of for climate loss and damage. Now the science has gotten incredibly and made incredible advances in our ability to attribute an event to the climate event, the weather event, to the percent that climate change has addressed it. But that's not the same as attributing the impact, right? The impact also has to do with our vulnerability. It has to do with, well, what are the decisions about where we developed and how much more likely would that have been versus because of our lack of development. And so the ability to actually attribute the loss and damage per se to a certain event versus another, and even the adaptation unit, makes it integrating into policy and investment strategies very difficult. And so I think that sort of science and technology and functionality complicates what also has this political and economic side to it. I don't think that solving the technology issue would all of a sudden, like, all the other problems would go away, but I think it would help to advance, to clarify how we do that. Because if you don't clarify that, then the issue of loss and damage becomes open-ended. There's no bounds to it. So it's hard for some of the wealthier companies to come in, or countries to come in and say, yes, we are open to taking liability for everything. So I think advancing in that space is really important for us all to think about. And I know there's a lot of work being done in that space, and it's a hard, because part of it's science, part of it's art, part of it's politics, right? So we have
to, right. Are you putting together some thoughts, personally on this, as to how you would actually go about disentangling these different elements?
Well, it's something that I've been sort of passionate about throughout my career. How do you think about doing these things? Initially, it was sort of to figure out, well, how do you assess some vulnerability, and how do you assess decreases in that vulnerability in terms of, like, are your investments being effective? So it's something I sort of engage in whenever I get an opportunity to bring people in, because I think it's so important and central to this global issue. But at this point now, it's not sort of central to my work, although I think increasingly at Microsoft, we're also thinking about how do we support the world in adaptation space. And so in that sense, I do think there's a role for science and technology at that intersection to do it. So maybe watch that space, and I'll come back to it at a different time.
Fantastic. So, you keep on talking about technology, and that has been, at a time of complicated international relations, actually a relatively positive story. We see climate tech booming, perhaps more than other forms of tech, and innovation all over the place. Price of clean energy continues to fall. Business leaders also increasingly acknowledging their part in tackling this crisis. At the same time, we also see growing scrutiny of the private sector's commitment to climate action, questions of whether what they're doing is real, whether it's greenwashing and so forth. Perhaps we just sort of start, before going maybe into more detail about Microsoft's own commitments. Where do you see the state right now of the private sector? And I know that's a very big concept, the private sector, but business leaders' kind of attitude to climate. How are we actually seeing a genuine shift taking place right now?
Well, I mean, I think across the board, the private sector is deeply engaged on this issue, and it's moving beyond what I think was initially a reputation issue. You had to at least have something which was promoting this greenwashing. But I think it's also a survival issue for companies, and both because there's a recognition that companies need to address this internally because of the risks that are coming on, transition risks, physical risks. This is a world that everybody needs to adjust to. But also, there is a sustainability service industry that's emerging, and competition in this space. And if a company's direction doesn't have some component of meeting those needs to society as well, not all companies, of course, but it's pretty across the board, not just mitigation, but managing climate risks, and putting that also in the natures in addressing and conserving and being nature positive as well. So that part of it, how do you play in this space? How do you protect your business in the context of the business model, the business infrastructure, is, I think, a critical piece. Now, you mentioned the challenges of, well, how do you keep the community? How do you know that this is not just greenwashing?
Right.
I do think that there's a need to have a lot of transparency, and increasingly there is that demand for transparency and standards and compliance, and those are things that we've called for and we need to step up on that. And I think part of the science and technology is enabling us to as well, which, when I think about this and look out, I don't know, 5 years, I think how we are reporting, how we are verifying, it's going to change. It's going to look so different than it does today. And keeping up with that alone is, can be a full-time job because it's changing so quickly. And I think that will help facilitate faster movement.
I mean, it would certainly be in a company's interest who's genuinely doing good stuff, as it were, for the climate, the planet, to have mechanisms out there which, allow for scrutiny to show that their stuff is real, whereas other people's might not be. Are you seeing governments sufficiently sort of listening to your calls for having these sort of clearer verification standards, monitoring standards, all the kind of things that might help convince the public that this stuff is real? How do you, in some ways, the private sector has been ahead of governments on this kind of stuff. So how are you seeing the response by governments to creating these tools to address the sort of the greenwashing issue? For many NGOs right now, this is the year of challenging greenwashing. It's kind of the thing they're on. So how are you seeing the sort of the ecosystem responding to that challenge?
Well, I think that, at COP26, the UN Secretary General launched an initiative to really kind of take on the private sector in a way that the UN hadn't before. I mean, obviously that there'd been a real opening of the tent to other actors over the last 5 to 10 years in the UN. So not that engagement hasn't been around, but the call for an expert panel to really structure guidance for private sector and other non-state actors to make commitments in this space and hold them accountable for that in a way that they haven't, and is I think is an indicator of where we're headed. And the European Union, the US are beginning to set and others are beginning to set compliance for reporting and disclosure. And so there's a movement in that space. But in terms of the technologies, I think that's almost coming from the private sector. And there was an interesting report out recently in September, I guess it came out, from the National Academy of Sciences that brought engagement globally of trying to make sense of all the different sources of information, greenhouse gas information, for decision making and verification and disclosure processes that the government process is going into. And I think one of the key messages in that is that the direction of the future that is headed and that we need to sort of accelerate for us to be able to have reliable and verifiable information for greenhouse gas reporting is in this sort of hybrid mode where we combine activity data, we combine atmospheric data, we combine modeling and AI, and we do this in a way that's transparent enough that can be verified. We have projects that are coming out in this space. There's some evaluation of saying, well, this may be directionally in the right way, but we don't have enough information to evaluate it yet. But that's the direction that we're heading. And I think working that whole space out, where we land on that, it will take some time. It will take public-private partnerships. There's a big role for the private sector in that space for sure. So I think the combination of public-private partnerships in the science and technology space combined with the government's role in setting the compliance mechanisms and review processes is what needs to come together to get us to move forward.
Maybe I could now dig into a little bit Microsoft's amazing, striking promise a couple of years back to become carbon negative by 2030. That means both cutting emissions at different scopes. And I remember Microsoft had a really interesting blog laying out some of those challenges and reports since, but also, removing, as it were, historic emissions, removing carbon from the atmosphere. 2 years on or so, what have you learned about the opportunities, challenges for carbon removal? The sector certainly seems to be growing pretty quickly, but I'm not sure. Where do you think we stand right now on the carbon removal side of things?
Yeah, well, we engage in carbon removal in multiple different fronts, right? We have a global climate innovation fund, $1 billion fund, which a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that goes into investing in carbon removal and reductions. And a lot of that is in technology-based, not exclusively, but in technology-based direct air capture and storage. We've invested in Climeworks and their new plant in Iceland. And we also focus on this in the context of, we have a program that purchases removal, as you know. And then we also engage in this in the context of our policy work. I will say we're also innovating in our own industry setting to figure out how can we, within our structures of different sites, remove carbon in the same site. So we're engaged
in setting as opposed to offsetting.
I think. And we have we have an incredible cutting edge research institution, Microsoft Research, which my team works with them to connect with sustainability sciences around the world. So we're engaged on these issues, and it's really exciting space to be able to think about this from so many, because we need to think about these from so many different angles to address them. So the technology space needs that investment in all that space. It's early stages. We continue to push forward in advancing in all these angles. But on our personal purchases right now, in terms of carbon removal, the vast majority of our purchases are in nature-based.
Right.
And that's basically because of supply. That's basically because of the combination of price and supply. So the challenge, and that will be true for a while, because the ramping up of the supply of high quality, or of the ramping of supply of technology-based removal is still years down the road. And so in the context of nature-based removal, the challenge is there's a really limited supply of high quality removal. And part of that is that, and part of the challenge is it's hard to find the good supply, because we don't have the structure to weed through it. We have a growing team of people who are working full time to try to sort out, what is the best quality. I'm incredibly impressed by the rigor that our team works at.
And actually, I'd love to say a little bit more about how you go about assessing the quality. And since we're on nature-based, we'll stick on nature-based and we'll move to technology in a second. But on the nature-based stuff, especially as there's just been more and more scrutiny and, in many cases, rejections of nature-based offsets as junk, right? And there is, at the same time, definitely efforts, both voluntary and through different policies in the EU and so forth, to try and start working out how to quantify what is high integrity as opposed to low integrity removals. And I'd love to, and I can imagine as a company, you've both got your internal science, but also a bewildering array of different ways of measuring this stuff. How are you going about, and what standards are you using to decide between, in effect, the good carbon removal versus the bad carbon removal, or however we might say it simplistically? But yeah, I'd love to know more about that.
Well, I think one of the big lenses between when we get a lot of proposals in is actually, the first lens is that most of the carbon in nature supply out there is avoided emissions offsets, not carbon removal. And so even just that one lens, we have constrained our purchases to carbon removal. And so doing that first lens is actually sometimes difficult in itself because people present it, even though we ask for removal in this joint context, and then they're making the case that part of it is removal, and then you have to assess which one is removal. And so there's that component. But of course, some of the big issues there are questions of, permanence,
Exactly.
leakage, additionality. And so these are the sort of the big items there. And we are increasingly, and I certainly am a big believer in this, of really needing to recognize that you can't rely on investing in nature as permanent. And so when we think of our investments, we have a certain percentage that's reliable, permanent, reliable, medium, and potentially more shorter term, with an understanding that we will be shifting and to a bigger percentage of that reliable permanent as supply increases, and a recognition that we need to deal with the reality that some of the temporary storage, for example, in forests, is more temporary, and how do we deal with that? And so part of that is we have buffer zones. Part of that is we're beginning to innovate and think about, well, maybe we should be thinking about this in a more broadly different way and just really face up to this. I think we're still figuring that out. My team has done research with modelers around the world to think about how to think about this in the planetary context with climate modeling. And one of the things that we've been really looking at is modeling the value of temporary storage with it, not in the context of comparing it to permanent, which a lot of people have done. That's been the sort of focus, but instead in terms of comparing it to comparing it to peak warming. So one analysis we did is if we store carbon in forests for, let's say, 30 years, and we are able to reach peak warming by then, and then everything is gradually lost, there's still a value for cutting off the peak. So there's a permanent climate value, as long as it's not seen as replacing carbon emissions from reductions of fossil fuels, but seeing as complementary. And that approach to thinking about recognizing the value of nature for sort of trimming off that peak, and not seeing it as equivalent to permanency, but seeing it as critical for permanent climate impact as a complement to emissions reductions. I think that is a really critical space, and unpacking how to integrate that into our policies is critical. And I just want to say one other thing about that is that, because we're also looking at this, how do we integrate this in the context of thinking about it together with biodiversity? The idea that nature has to be part of this solution for climate. It provides carbon removal, it provides carbon, there's this carbon storage there, it's critical for resilience. And if we don't think about this holistically, and we don't think it as a core part of the solution, we will be in trouble across the board. So I don't think these questions, I fear that these questions about the challenges of investing in nature for climate solutions being a greenwashing could push us away from investing in nature, which is really bad road to go down. And so I'm really working with our team and researchers around the world to say, let's figure out a way that characterizes nature's contributions to climate solutions effectively, rather than trying to put it in a box and have it meet standards that it just can never meet.
And that sounds very sensible. I guess the question is, though, how do you then put that into an equation that says Microsoft is now net negative when maybe timber's only going to be there for 30 years or whatever? How, and that's probably simplistic, saying, well, are we plus or minus now on the sort of carbon ledger? But you've got to claim, we're going to go net negative, and yet some of this stuff is tied up in non-permanent forms of carbon removal. How do you actually go about accounting for that against that claim?
Yeah, so if you know, as I said, we're working with people internally and externally and thinking about this in this broader context. But from the sort of my team's perspective and thinking about the science of it, if you think about the cumulative role of 10 years and you for a temporary piece and think first, there's a really critical urgent need to protect nature now.
Right.
And if you want to think about that in the longer term, so and what is a temporary time frame within which to think about that, because it's not a year, and 100 years is for the permanent. I think it's more than that. But if you think about this in the context of peak warming, because that connects us to the short term with the long term, with the emissions reduction. So if we get to peak warming, that means we have effectively reduced our fossil fuel emissions as well. And then in the context of giving that credit, then you can be accounted for in terms of that cumulative pieces, but you don't have to contract for 1,000 years, which is unrealistic, except for something like DAX.
Right.
And so you can think about it as a short-term and long-term piece, and then if you want that equivalency long-term, you need to have that short-term piece repeated, right? And so this sort of stacking on top of each other, but within this context of a short-term window. It's not a year, because a year isn't going to help you. But if you think about it, 30 years with the assumption that we are in a position to be able to also reduce these other, fossil fuel emissions, then we have a win. And the other piece of it, I think, to do that is, right now we have this structure that's very binary. We say we have these constraints. You have to be permanent. You have to be additional. You have to have no leakage. And because it's either yes, no, it actually pushes everybody right to the line where you could say, okay, we have to choose yes, no, so we're going to choose yes.
Right.
And so, the way I think about it is we need to move beyond the binary approach to our crediting. And as we do that, we will be able to get a broader spectrum of the value and look at the likelihood that we're going to achieve these and create the buffer zones so that we can at least get those important chunks to capture the value of the short-term piece. It's not simple, but I think we need to rethink how we're doing this, not just tweak it and try to fit the square peg into the round hole.
If we could just quickly turn to the technological approaches to carbon removal. You've mentioned DAX, direct air capture and storage, which and your investment in Climeworks, which certainly has had a lot of attention recently. There are obviously other approaches as well. There's some hybrid approach, bioenergy capture and storage, but all sorts of other ideas around soil regeneration and biochar and enhanced weathering and all the rest of it. I'm just interested, and some of this has had a bit of a boost recently, I guess, by the US's Inflation Reduction Act, which has definitely envisaged a certain amount of backing for these technologies. Where do you but then again, you said though you don't actually see this coming online in a significant way for a little while. So I'd love your thoughts about the state of these new technologies. How long do you think it would be until we actually start to see large scale opportunities there to remove carbon? And I'd also be fascinated to learn a little bit more about what your teams are dreaming up. Have you got any new approaches that we haven't already got on our various carbon removal fact sheets in terms of insetting? I mean, this is it, right? All companies are trying to work out how to do this in a way that is complementary to their existing operations and how they use what they know, how to make this happen. So if you just give me a sense of where you see the technology size of carbon removal at the moment.
Well, I first want to highlight, we're not going to remove our way out of this problem. I just want to really highlight that it's got to come on board at scale for us to succeed by mid-century. But it only makes a dent in the problem if we basically reduce to almost 90% of our emissions more broadly at a global scale. So I do want to really emphasize that. And we put a lot of attention to carbon removal because we've made a commitment to remove all of our emissions that we have put into the atmosphere since our company began. So that's one of the reasons, but we also realize that there is a role at this intersection of science and technology that the world needs to succeed. And so we're focused on that as sort of this enabling conditions that we've said. So I really want to really emphasize that. In the context of the technology space, my sense is, and I think broadly, many people at Microsoft believe this too. I don't want to speak for the company as a broad brush statement, but I do think a lot of the leaders in the space believe this, and that is that the basic technology that is going to succeed in this space in carbon removal probably already exists. It's just like refining it. I don't think I'm not saying there won't be breakthroughs, but I don't think I think that development, that what is done at scale by mid-century is probably a version of it is on the market today.
Okay.
But having said that, we do have, I mentioned we have Microsoft Research, which has a sustainability research program. My team works closely with them to sort of set the agenda and make connections and work in this. And one of the big areas is carbon removal. And a key piece of that is materials. And AI research can do wonders to really accelerate research findings in materials. The analogy I think about this is how AI has been so helpful in accelerating the discovery of vaccines for COVID, and that ability to accelerate and explore new dimensions of opportunities that we just couldn't do without AI is really exciting. But you need to also work with people who are also working on the ground to have that feedback. And that's one of the things that has emerged from our Microsoft Climate Research Initiative that we launched last year. And it is beginning to expand, working with people around the globe to leverage Microsoft's leadership in the AI space with people who are working on it. So I do think that is an area that there's kind of some of the bottlenecks for the existing technologies. Materials is a huge piece, not just for the carbon removal, but also for so much of the embodied emissions challenges that we have in our supply chain and in addressing these issues. So we're investing quite a bit into the materials research space. And then operationally, how to integrate these components of this into infrastructure. So it's not necessarily only in Iceland, but how do you have this be more operational? So I don't think this the core technology is my sense, although I think that there's advances in biochar and weathering but the core structure, my instinct is that those will be there.
And it is an exciting field, but in the meantime, right now, temperature continues to go up, CO2 emissions continue to go up, climate impacts continue to intensify. Given these risks, we're seeing some scientists exploring the potential for solar radiation modification, the idea that you would reflect a small portion of incoming sunlight back into space. But of course, these ideas bring risks and uncertainties of their own. And it's the challenge now is to work out whether that could be an option to reduce risk and how you actually go about measuring that against all sorts of different metrics and outcomes. So what are your sort of top line thoughts on solar radiation modification and that whole area of inquiry?
Well, as a simple answer, I'm definitely not in favor of pursuing SRM. Having said that, I am very much in favor of enhancing our understanding of the risks and the opportunities it presents and the governance challenges and how decisions are made around this. I think it's essential, and have thought so, and have sort of been engaged with the C2G, but even previously in trying to push how we think about these issues, and more broadly, not setting up the structure so that we can ensure that we can do the science safely and recognize that this has to be part of the spectrum of challenges. The sort of solution set that we're exploring, that's not the solution set that we necessarily choose, has evolved over the years, right? It used to be sort of mitigation, big M, adaptation as a footnote. Mitigation, adaptation became together. Mitigation sort of expanded to carbon removal. That was sort of seen as a outside kind of crazy thing for so many years. Now it's sort of mainstream. And then loss and damage has sort of emerged. And I think the issue of solar radiation management and others in this sort of general realm has to be part of the discussion alongside of all of these. But having said that, if I was asked, should we do this, I would say no. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a discussion.
So what kind of research do you think might be needed, and what would be a good way to fund and govern that research?
Well, I'm definitely not sort of in a position of knowledge in depth to be able to present a research agenda for SRM by any stretch of the imagination. But I think one of the big key pieces of this is the need to start to have a discussion about what the world looks like if we don't meet 1.5 and 2 degrees. And I think we can't give up hope, and we can't stop working towards that. And I no one can stay working in this field for 25 years and not be optimistic, because would have sort of fizzled out a long time ago. But I do think that we need a broader science and discussions and policy discussions of what happens. And that's not just about the impacts expected, but how would and should we respond. And this would include SRM, loss and damage, managing mass scale migration, large scale climate tipping points. These are all interconnected. And I would argue that part of thinking about the agenda and research funding in that space is about, okay, how do we integrate this next phase, right? So there's a special report of the IPCC on 1.5 that was done. How can we position these sorts of questions of special reports that's maybe not squarely in the IPCC's realm, but broader, without undermining efforts to keep moving to the 1.5 realm? I mean, I think we can do it without undermining it, because I think, to be honest, it's so scary once we outline it that it's going to reinforce the need. But I still think it's a conversation that we have to have. But I don't think that the SRM can be thought of outside of those other pieces. That's where I stand on that.
And to be honest, there was a lot of reluctance for a while to acknowledge that we're likely to blow past 1.5 for some of the reasons that. But that's kind of over the past year that people have crossed that. Basically, more and more reports, UN leading scientists, and in the media as well. Let's just deal with the reality. Now, of course, we've got this Global Overshoot Commission to try and deal with reality of, or the almost certainty of blowing past 1.5. But in all of this, certainly to begin with, the ones the most to gain or the most to lose from getting this right is the Global South. How can the Global South be better included in these conversations around SRM and the other sort of things, is what more can be done to support and include the Global South in this conversation?
Well, I think as we begin to expand that discussion on what's the world, how do we manage and to a world of past 1.5 and even past 2, and really begin to look what is that outer bound, because even the models that we have, it's super exciting to think about the ambition, right? We have a lot of sure, we need more ambition, always need more ambition, but the reality is that if we direct our energy to motivating more ambition, we should direct that energy to just implementation now, it seems, because we're pretty good on the ambition. But still, the models that say where we're headed are only true if people are able to implement their ambition, right? And so that's a challenge. So there's still uncertainty in that. I mean, I know that the some of the higher scenarios in the IPCC are now, we shouldn't be even using those because they're kind of unrealistic, and that's a super exciting discussion to be having. Having said that, I think that as we begin to look at that world of post 1.5 and 2 and over 2, these issues that are emerging around equity is going to become even more front and center, right? And so I think that discussion and that agenda has to have equity at the middle, or we are not going to be able to achieve all those different pieces, and we will, at some point have scenarios that go high again, right? Because that has to be at the central piece. And so how does that happen in general? It's interesting. I think about as you mentioned in my introduction, I used to run, I was the executive director of Future Earth, which is an international network of researchers and innovators to support policy and action on sustainability. And I remember when I was asked to be executive director, I said, you don't want me. You don't want someone from the US leading this organization, because it's got to be driven by someone in the Global South. And I did take on the role for a few years. But I think that the reality is that we do need to have the voice at that center. And we have expanded Future Earth, I shouldn't say we, Future Earth has expanded its presence now in the Global South, having offices in different areas. And with a hub in India and one in Africa now, and an expansion in Asia. And I think that sort of central understanding of what are the issues in those areas as we move into this world of thinking, what happens next, will be really critical for that structure moving forward. And not just in the IPCC and the Future Earth kind of world, but at that intersection of how do we work in the science, technology, policy, business. And we need to change the center of gravity so that we can really be grounded in that perspective. And that's sort of skirting the question a bit, I realize it, but I think that's such a fundamental piece of sort of a mindset of how we think about this. It's hard to do, but I think it's a mindset change.
I realize we've gone over already the time that we were, but maybe if I just one last thing, you mentioned you were optimistic. You'd managed to maintain an element of optimism. How? It's if I mean, I'm right now, I'm listening to the Greta Thunberg sort of compilation of all the science on Audible, and my goodness, it's grim listening. And how do you actually maintain a sense of optimism and motivation? Do you turn to any philosophies to help you do that? Any particular practices? What do you do?
I part of I think so there are three things that I think keep me optimistic. One is, you mentioned Greta Thunberg. I think youth. I have I'm just thinking about my kid, he's 20 now, and they, for the last, I don't know, 5 years, have been very involved in climate and have climate activism, and have then shifted to seeing social justice as this intersection and is leading the way. And the depth and passion and of the sort of transformation that they see and their cohort sees, and we see around the world, but that personal connection also with Cedar, with my kid, is, I think, inspiring. I was an activist when I was young, but the depth of understanding of these complex issues, I think, of the youth is gives me hope. It also, of course, motivates me because they are our children. The other area where I see gives inspiration is actually in the science and technology realm. Now, for so long, so much of the science was running these different models and saying, oh my gosh, what do we have to do on policy? It's, we're heading to 6 degrees if we don't do anything. And it's really scary. But I think, especially being here in a place like Microsoft, where this intersection of the incredible innovation in the technology space with the sustainability science, what you can do to how you can think outside the box and really be able to imagine changes of totally revolutionizing how business models work and how we do things is I think exciting. Of course, there's a lot of context outside of that science and technology to make that happen fast enough, but I think that's an area. And another area I think is the business world. I do think that the private sector has a huge role to play if we're going to be successful in this. I'm not saying there aren't challenges with that, but I do think that there's a role that that as we rethink our business models and as we as Microsoft help through integrating the digital transformation to help others rethink their business models, we can make this happen.
Well, Amy Luers, thank you so much for being such a great guest on C2G Talk.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here.